All right. So today I want to discuss the topic of consent, not consent on its own, because I talked about that before, um, but more specifically whether it's possible to give consent to existence or to being born after being born. That was a topic that came up in our Discord server. We were talking about the consent argument. And basically, the consent argument says that, okay, when we come into existence, the situation that we're in, this existence is imposed upon us. It's not something that we were asked about. So the objection goes, okay, what if the person who exists right now then consents to existing? Would that make everything fine or not? So for consent, the example that I usually use is the example of psychedelics. I ask, is it okay for me to put psychedelic in someone else's food without their knowing? And the answer is obviously no, because when they get into that that state in the psychedelic world, then they're not really consenting to the situation that they're in. That environment is imposed upon them. So that's one of the reasons that we're not, it's not permissible to do so. So the argument goes the same way for existence. I'm not going to go into details about the consent argument on its own, just about the fact whether it's possible to give consent after birth. Now on like prima facie, like on the face of it, it looks like that it's fine. Like if someone gives consent after being born, like imagine that you bring someone into this world and then they say, okay, yeah, we're fine, we're okay, it's okay, I give consent to existence. Does that mean that it's okay? I mean, it looks fine, but then we have to be careful about our intuition. I mean, in ethics, we always have to be careful about common sense, because sometimes we get things wrong. And I believe this is one of those cases where the concept of moral luck comes into play. Moral luck is something that Thomas Nagel talked about it in his paper on moral luck. So basically the idea is that whether something that we do is blameworthy or not should not depend on luck, basically. If I'm a lucky person, that doesn't mean that I can get away with doing something bad. For instance, if you are driving and you have a couple of passengers in your car, while you're driving, you're not paying attention to the road. You're basically looking around, you're looking at the boards, you're not paying attention. And as you're doing that, your car starts to shift to the other lane. Now, you suddenly realize that and you come back to your own lane, but fortunately, you were lucky, there were no other cars coming from the other side, so nothing happens. Now imagine exactly the same situation, that you start to shift to the other lane, but there is actually a car, you get into an accident and all the passengers in the car die. Now the question is, does the blame differ between these two different cases? Like the common sense, in our common sense, we feel like that there is a difference, right? In the sense that when there is an accident, we actually blame the person more than the case that there is no accident. But that shouldn't make sense, because if what they did was wrong, if what they did was blameworthy, then it shouldn't depend on their luck. It shouldn't depend whether there is something else happening in the world that is just by chance can determine whether what you did is wrong or not. So that's the concept of moral luck, right? And the idea is that our common sense basically is making a mistake here. We should actually hold both cases in the same amount of blameworthiness. If it's wrong to look at billboards while you're driving and you're shifting to the other lane, it's exactly the same thing you're doing in both cases. It doesn't matter if it leads to an accident or it doesn't. What matters is that you're doing something wrong. Of course, you can see that. We're not having a utilitarian view here. So it's the same thing with the consent, right? So let's go back to that example of psychedelics and see how it relates to the concept of moral luck. So let's suppose that you put psychedelic in someone else's food, right? So they go into this, they're gonna have a trip, and let's say that in that trip they actually have a very bad experience. So, and they don't like where they are, and they say, hey, like, someone drugged me, someone imposed this on me, I don't want to be here. Of course that's possible, right? But the other thing is that it's also possible that you give them the drug, but then they say, hey, I consent to this, I'm okay. The point is that what we do should not depend on whether we get lucky, whether we get lucky that they're gonna have a good trip or a bad trip. That depends on a lot of factors. That would depend on the weather. That depends on everything that happens in their life, what happened during the day, the music that you're playing on. Everything will determine the trip that you're gonna have, and a lot of these things are out of they're based on chance. So if I do that, and in the case that they're gonna have a bad trip, if it's blameworthy to do such a thing in that case, which obviously it is, then it should also be blameworthy even if they have a good experience. So even if they say while they're high on that drug, that they say, hey, it's fine, like I consent to this, what we did was wrong. And so the same thing translates also to the concept of antinatalism. So even if I bring someone into this world and they, after being born, they say, hey, you know what, I consent to my existence, it's fine. That does not mean that what we did was right. Because again, it's not about the luck. It's about what we did was wrong. We imposed life on someone without their consent. So, even though the common sense, it seems that if someone says, hey, I'm okay with being alive, somehow reduces the guilt of parents. But if we think about it a little bit and take note of this kind of moral luck dynamics playing here, then we can see that this is not actually correct. I mean, we can actually argue why we should also blame the person responsible in both cases. So that's about the consent after being born. There's also another idea that comes up related to this consent after being born, that someone might claim that again, go back to that being drugged. Could it be possible that I could design a specific drug that when I give it to you without your consent, that drug basically manipulates you in a sense that you will give consent while you're on the drug. So I designed the drug in a specific sense that you will actually consent to being on it. So while you're on it, so I put it in your food without you knowing it. But while you're high, if I ask you, hey, do you consent to this? I designed the drug specifically so you would answer it, yes. I'm absolutely fine with it. That's basically also a kind of argument that David Benatar has regarding the fact that people don't really see their life as it is, that we have this kind of bias towards seeing our life better as it is. And so here someone also might argue that in the same sense that I can give you a drug that just by nature of it, it conditions you to consent to being on that drug. It might be that when we come into existence, we might be kind of conditioned to give consent to our existence. Now I can imagine that argument working. And there's also an objection to this. And the objection is that if we kind of, undercuts that kind of, consent to existence, if we say, okay, that consent is not valid, that might invalidate a lot of other consents that we also give. So for instance, if we say our consent to existence is not valid, then it might be that your consent to go to the dentist also might not be valid. Now, I don't see how this objection might work because that's not necessarily true. I mean, we can imagine that the conditioning only is affecting the consent regarding the existence. Like even in the psychedelic case, imagine that you put that in someone else's food, they go into this world, and then within that world, they're having a conversation with someone, they go into the party, and in that party, they ask them, do you want water, or do you want beer, and then they select beer, for instance. Now, if you ask them, okay, did you give consent to being in the party and drinking this beer? I mean, that depends on what exactly you mean by, did you consent to this? What do you mean by that? If you mean just selecting water or beer, drinking at this party, yes, I did give consent. And I can imagine how that consent might be actually valid in that world, because it's a consent condition to that universe that they're living in. But of course, if by this we mean, like, did you consent to being in this universe, in this kind of environment, and, being in this party and drinking beer, then we might answer no, because I did not give consent to being in this universe in the first place. So I just wanted to mention that. I'm not really interested in that argument or the objection to it. I don't think the objection works. I don't think the argument is a very solid argument. What I'm interested in is that consent part. And it seems to me that if we give consent, if we cannot get consent, then it's wrong to do, and it doesn't matter whether we get lucky and our kid might consent to being born. The blameworthiness of our actions should not depend on luck. That's again, I know that consent argument is not a very popular argument, but for me it works as well as it could. So just let me know what you think.